They called it resisting, the word they used in the document that transferred my ownership from the Stanhope Plantation in Tensas Parish, Louisiana, to the Wycliffe Estate in Carroll County, Mississippi, was resisting. It appeared in the bill of sale the way words in such documents always appeared, with the clinical neutrality of language that has been drained of everything human so that what remains can be transferred without complication. Resisting, as if the word were sufficient explanation, as if the word contained within it everything that had happened and everything that had been done to me and everything that I had done in response to what had been done to me, compressed into 8 letters and presented to the buyer as a disclosure of known defects. He bought me anyway. Franklin Wycliffe was 61 years old and had been purchasing enslaved people with disclosed defects for 30 years, on the theory that what other men called defects were frequently assets that had been mislabeled by men who did not know how to use what they had. He had explained this theory to his overseer, a man named Pruitt, on the morning he bought me at the Natchez slave market in January of 1860, standing in front of me, with the assessing attention of a man who has spent 30 years looking at people and deciding what they were actually worth versus what they were being presented as worth. He looked at me for a long time, then he said, "What did she resist?" The seller, a representative of the Stanhope estate, said she had resisted the examination. Franklin Wycliffe said, "What examination?" The seller said the plantation doctor's examination, that the doctor had attempted a standard examination and that she had made it impossible to complete. Franklin Wycliffe looked at me again. He said, "How old is she?" The seller said 24. He said, "What skills does she have?" The seller said she had been a field worker for 8 years, and before that, a house servant, and that she had some knowledge of remedies and plant medicine learned from an older woman on the plantation who had since died. Franklin Wycliffe nodded. He made an offer that was below the asking price by enough to account for the disclosed defect, and above it by enough to account for his own assessment of the asset. The seller accepted. I was transferred. I want to tell you about the examination before I tell you about what came after, because the examination is where this story begins, and because what it was and what it produced and what I decided in the immediate aftermath of it determined everything that followed. Every decision I made from January of 1860 forward, every choice about what to learn and what to prepare and what to wait for and what to do when the waiting was done. The plantation doctor at the Stanhope estate was a man named Collier. He was 43 years old, and he had been the plantation doctor for the Stanhope estate for 11 years and for 2 neighboring estates as well, which gave him a practice across 3 plantations that amounted to something close to a medical monopoly in his part of Tensas Parish, and that gave him access to the people on those plantations with the professional authority that medical practice was supposed to confer, and that he had long since stopped distinguishing from a different kind of authority entirely. I had been on the Stanhope plantation for 8 years when Collier arrived for the quarterly examination in November of 1859. I knew about his examinations. Everyone on the Stanhope plantation knew about his examinations. The specific knowledge of what his examinations were and what they required and what happened to women who were examined was the kind of knowledge that moved through an enslaved community, the way essential knowledge always moved, quietly and completely, and to everyone who needed it. The women on the Stanhope plantation had been managing this knowledge for 11 years, which meant managing not just the knowledge itself, but the specific accommodations and evasions and arrangements that the knowledge required in order for what it described to be survived. The managing had limits. The limits were structural, built into the plantation's operation in the way that the limits on everything were built in, by the system that organized the operation, and that had given Collier his access, and that validated his authority, and that would respond to any challenge to that authority as a challenge to itself. I had watched the managing for 8 years. I had watched the accommodations and the evasions and the arrangements, and I had watched, more times than I could count, and more clearly than I could sometimes bear, the point at which the managing failed and the limits of the structural accommodation produced its inevitable result, which was that what Collier intended to do to whoever he had selected for the quarter's examination was done, because the system that gave him his access had no mechanism for preventing it and no interest in developing one. On the 3rd day of November of 1859, Collier selected me. I will not tell you what I did in the detail that the word resisting suggests. I will tell you that I made it impossible for him to complete what he intended to complete, and that making it impossible cost me things I am still counting. I will tell you that the cost was less than the alternative, and that I calculated the cost against the alternative with complete clarity before I began, and that the calculation was correct, and that I would make it again. I will tell you that Collier left the examination room and went to the Stanhope Estate's owner and reported that I was dangerous and could not be safely managed, and that the estate would be better served by selling me than by retaining me. The estate agreed. I was sold in January, and I was brought to Carroll County, Mississippi, to the Wycliffe Estate, where Franklin Wycliffe had decided that what the Stanhope Estate called a defect was something he could use. He was not wrong about that. He was not wrong in the way he imagined, which was that a woman who resisted plantation doctors could be managed by a man who understood people better than the Stanhope Estate had understood people, who could find the right approach, the right arrangement, the right combination of incentive and management that would redirect whatever quality had produced the resistance into something that served his operation. He was not wrong about the redirecting. He was wrong about the direction. The Wycliffe Estate in Carroll County, Mississippi, covered 3,000 acres of prime Delta cotton land, worked by 127 enslaved people. It was one of the more prosperous operations in Carroll County, which was a county of prosperous operations, the rich soil and the long-growing season and the cotton economy of the 1850s, having combined to produce a concentration of wealth in the Delta counties that was visible in the houses and the horses and the particular confidence of the men who owned them. Franklin Wycliffe was the 3rd generation of his family on that land. His grandfather had established the original claim. His father had expanded it. Franklin had expanded it further and had added to the expansion a set of business relationships in Greenwood and in Jackson and in New Orleans that connected the Wycliffe cotton to markets that the less strategically minded planters in Carroll County were not reaching. He was intelligent and he was successful, and he had survived 3 decades of managing a large plantation operation by being, in his own assessment and in the assessment of the people who knew him professionally, a good judge of what people were and what they could do. He was a good judge of what people were. He was not a good judge of what I was. Nobody had been a good judge of what I was. This was partly by design and partly by the particular blindness that I have described in every other account of every other person who had made the mistake of deciding they knew what I was before they had actually looked. The blindness that comes from certainty. The blindness that comes from a system that tells you that the people who work for you are a category rather than people, and that categories can be known by their labels, and that the labels are sufficient. Franklin Wycliffe's label for me was resisting. He had bought me on the basis of the label and had added to it his own assessment, which was that what the label described was redirectable. What the label actually described was a woman who had calculated a cost against an alternative and had paid the cost because the alternative was not acceptable, and who had arrived in Carroll County, Mississippi, with the absolute clarity of someone who has already paid more than they expected to pay, and who has decided that the payment will not be made again. The payment will not be made again. That was my foundation. That was what I had built everything else on from the moment I was transferred out of Tences Parish. The Wycliffe Estate had a plantation doctor. His name was Alderton. He was 38 years old and had been the estate's physician for 6 years, and his relationship to the women on the Wycliffe plantation was different from Collier's in its method, but not in its fundamental nature, which was the fundamental nature of a man who had been given access and authority, and who understood that the system giving him that access had no mechanism for limiting it. I learned about Alderton in my first week. I learned about him the way I learned about everything on every plantation I had been on, through the networks that carried essential information through enslaved communities, through the specific quality of silence that surrounded certain subjects and that told you as much as the subjects themselves, through the careful observation of who moved where and when and with what expression afterward. I learned what Alderton was, and I began preparing. What I was preparing required knowledge. The knowledge I already had was the plant medicine that the older woman on the Stanhope plantation had taught me before she died, which was a body of knowledge about what grew in Louisiana soil, and what each thing did, and how to prepare it, and what dosage produced what result. It was substantial knowledge accumulated over 8 years of learning from a woman who had been accumulating it for 40 years before she taught me. But Louisiana soil and Mississippi soil were different, and the plants that grew in them were different. And the specific knowledge I needed was knowledge of what grew in Carroll County, Mississippi, and what Carroll County, Mississippi produced that I could use for what I intended. I spent 6 months learning.
Franklin Wycliffe had assigned me to the house, which was consistent with his theory about redirecting what the Stanhope estate had called a defect, and the house gave me the access that the house always gave the people who worked in it. I organized correspondence, I prepared meals, I cleaned rooms. I was present in the spaces of the Wycliffe domestic life with the particular invisibility that housework produced in a woman who had been practicing invisibility since she was old enough to understand what it was for. I used the invisibility to learn the estate, not just the house, the grounds, the fields, the timber on the eastern section of the property, the creek that ran along the northern boundary and the wetlands beside it where things grew that did not grow in the cultivated fields, and that the people who cultivated the fields did not pay attention to, because the cultivated fields were what they were paid to pay attention to. I paid attention to the wetlands. I also paid attention to the kitchen garden, which was managed by a woman named Portia, who had been growing things on the Wycliffe estate for 23 years, and who knew Carroll County soil the way my teacher on the Stanhope plantation had known Tenses Parish soil, with the completeness of someone who has spent 2 decades in intimate daily contact with a specific piece of earth, and who has learned everything that the earth and the things growing in it will teach. Portia was 60 years old, and she did not trust me immediately, which was appropriate, because trust between people in impossible circumstances was built slowly and required demonstration, and I had arrived with nothing to demonstrate yet. I demonstrated over 4 months. What I demonstrated was knowledge, not my full knowledge. Enough. I helped Portia with things in the kitchen garden that my teacher had taught me, and that Portia recognized as the knowledge of someone who had been taught properly, not the partial knowledge of someone who had observed from a distance, but the complete knowledge of someone who had been given it directly by a woman who knew it completely. Portia recognized the knowledge. She began sharing hers. By the summer of 1860, I had what I needed from Portia and from my own observation of the wetlands, and from the 6 months of learning Carroll County, Mississippi. The way I had always learned every place I had been sent to live, from the ground up, from the smallest things, from the things no one was paying attention to, because no one had assigned the paying of attention to them. I had what I needed. I want to be precise about what I mean. I'm not going to describe what I had in the detail that the describing would provide, because the describing would be a different kind of document than the one I am making. And the document I am making is an account of what happened and why, not an instruction for how to replicate it. What I will say is that the knowledge my teacher had given me, and that Portia had expanded, was knowledge of what things do to bodies, and that some of what things do to bodies is heal them, and some of what they do is harm them, and that the difference between those 2 outcomes is often a matter of what thing and how much and in what form, and delivered by what means. I knew the difference. I had known it since my teacher taught me, and I had been refining the knowing for 8 years, and then for 6 more months in Carroll County, Mississippi, with Portia's addition to what I already had. What I had was sufficient for what I was planning. What I was planning required one more thing. It required an occasion. The occasion arrived in September of 1860, when Alderton came to the Wycliffe estate for the quarterly examination. I had known it was coming. The quarterly examination was in the Wycliffe estate's domestic calendar, the way everything that happened with regularity was in the domestic calendar, which I had been reading since the first week. September. The calendar said September. I had been reading the calendar since January, 9 months. 9 months between the day I arrived in Carroll County, Mississippi, and the day the occasion arrived, which was not a long time for the kind of preparation I was doing, but was sufficient because I had been doing the preparation,
with the complete attention of someone who has one thing to focus on and who is focusing on it. The evening before Alderton's arrival, I went to the kitchen garden after dark. I went alone. What I did in the kitchen garden after dark, I did with the precision of someone who has rehearsed a thing until the rehearsal and the doing are indistinguishable, until the muscle memory and the knowledge and the intention have merged into a single action that requires no deliberation, because the deliberation has already been done. I was deliberate. I was exact. I was finished before the house began to show lights in the upstairs windows. Alderton arrived on the morning of the examination in the particular manner of a man who has been doing something for 6 years and who has organized his relationship to the doing of it around his certainty that the doing of it is unremarkable. He arrived with his bag. He arranged himself in the room that had been prepared for the examination. He requested the first examination. He examined. He was thorough. He moved through the morning with the efficiency of a man conducting a professional obligation that has been arranged for his convenience and that he has no reason to believe will not proceed as it has always proceeded. He requested the midday meal from the house. I brought it. This is the moment I want to describe carefully, because it is the moment that everything else was pointing toward, and because the careful description of it is the thing that the account requires in order to be complete. I brought the midday meal to Alderton in the examination room. I set it on the table beside him. He did not look at me. He was reviewing notes from the morning's examinations. He was a man engaged in his professional work in a room that the plantation had arranged for his professional work, and the woman who brought his meal was not a person he needed to look at. She was the function of the meal arriving. I set the meal on the table. I left the room. I returned to the kitchen. Portia was there. She looked at me. I looked at her. Neither of us said anything. I began the preparation for the evening meal. Alderton finished his midday meal at some point in the early afternoon. He resumed his examinations. He completed the afternoon's schedule. He returned to the examination room to collect his notes and his bag and to prepare for the evening, which he would spend in the Wycliffe house as a guest, before returning to Greenwood in the morning. He did not complete the preparation. What happened in the examination room in the late afternoon of September of 1860 was not witnessed by anyone except Alderton, and therefore the account of it that exists in the official record is Alderton's account, which is the account of a man who did not know what was happening to him, and who, in the confusion and the fear of what was happening to him, attributed what was happening to causes that were available to him in the catalogue of possible causes. He attributed it to something he had eaten. He told Franklin Wycliffe that evening that he believed he had eaten something that had disagreed with him severely. Franklin Wycliffe sent for a doctor from Greenwood. The doctor from Greenwood arrived the following morning. Alderton did not survive the night. The doctor from Greenwood examined what had happened and produced an assessment that was consistent with Alderton's own assessment, that he had consumed something that had produced an acute reaction, and that the reaction had been severe enough to be fatal, and that this kind of acute reaction was not unheard of in the Delta counties, where certain environmental factors produced occasionally virulent versions of ordinary digestive disturbances. Franklin Wycliffe accepted this assessment. He was a man who had bought a narrative about what had happened, and that narrative did not include the possibility that the woman he had purchased in January as a redirectable defect had spent 9 months preparing for what he would have needed, if he had known to describe it, as the most deliberate act of his entire operation. He did not know. Nobody knew. Portia knew. Portia had looked at me in the kitchen after I returned from delivering the midday meal, and she had known in the way that a woman who has spent 23 years growing things in Carroll County, Mississippi soil, and who has been teaching another woman what she knows for 4 months, knows when the knowledge has been used. She knew. She said nothing. She began the preparation for the evening meal. I worked beside her, and we did not speak about what had happened, and we would not speak about it, because what had happened between us was the particular kind of thing that does not require speaking, that is understood completely by both parties, and that is kept in the place where both parties have decided it lives, which is the place where the things that are understood completely and kept completely reside. We kept it there. The investigation that followed Alderton's death was the investigation of a man who had consumed something that had disagreed with him. It examined the meal he had eaten and found nothing conclusive which was consistent with what I had prepared, and it examined the circumstances of his death and found nothing inconsistent with what the doctor from Greenwood had assessed, which was also consistent with what I had prepared. I was not investigated. I was not looked at as a source of anything relevant to the investigation, because I was the woman who brought the meal, and the meal had been examined, and the examination had found nothing conclusive, and the woman who brought the meal was not a person. The investigation was in the habit of looking at as a source of anything. I was furniture. I was the function of the meal arriving. I was the woman they had purchased in January as a redirectable defect. I had been redirected in the direction I had chosen. Franklin Wycliffe hired a new plantation doctor in November. His name was Prewitt. He was 29 years old and he was new to Carroll County, and he had not been told about Alderton except that Alderton had died suddenly of a digestive complaint in September, and that the position was therefore available. He arrived in November with his bag. He arranged himself in the room that had been prepared for his use. He was told the examination schedule would begin in December. I watched him arrive from the window of the room I was cleaning. I watched him take his bag from the wagon and carry it into the house. I watched him with the complete attention of someone who has been paying attention to everything since January and who has not stopped and who will not stop. I watched him, and I began learning the difference between Prewitt and Alderton. I want to be clear about this, because the account of what I did to Alderton could suggest something that I want to correct before the suggestion becomes the story. I did not decide in January that Alderton would die in September. I decided in January that what had happened in Tensas Parish would not happen again, and that what I would do to ensure it would not happen again would depend on what the situation required. The situation required what it required. If the situation had required something else, it would have received something else. What I was doing was not a predetermined program. It was a response to a system that had given certain men access to women's bodies with professional authority, and that had no mechanism for withdrawing that access and no interest in developing one. A response to the specific version of that access that had been directed at me in Tensas Parish and that had been waiting to be directed at me again in Carroll County. A response calibrated to what the situation required. The situation required what it required. Prewitt was different from Alderton in ways that I was learning. He was young, and he was new to Carroll County, and he was, from what I could observe in the first weeks of his presence in the Wycliffe house, a man who was still forming the habits that his position would eventually solidify into. He was not yet what the position would make him. He was in the process of becoming it. I watched the process. I watched it with the same attention I had brought to everything in Carroll County since January, and I was learning what the process was producing, and I was making, in parallel with the watching, the calculations that the watching made necessary. I want to tell you what I was calculating. I was calculating the distance between what Prewitt was now and what the position would make him if the position were allowed to make him. Between the 29-year-old who was new to Carroll County and still forming his habits and the man who would arrive in 6 months or a year or 2 years once the position had finished its work on him. I was calculating whether the distance was closable, whether what he was now could be redirected, not in the way that Franklin Wycliffe had imagined redirecting me, but in the actual sense of the word, towards something other than what the position was designing him to become. The calculation required information I did not yet have. I continued watching. In December, Prewitt conducted his first examination. I was not among the women examined in December. I had been assigned to the house, and the house women were on a different schedule than the field workers, and the December examination was for field workers. I watched how Prewitt conducted the examination. I watched not from inside the process, but from the edges of it, from the information that came back through the community afterward, the specific texture of that information, what it said and what it did not say, and what the gap between those two things told me. The information told me something. I sat with it for a week. Then I went to Portia. We were alone in the kitchen garden in the early morning, which was when we were often alone, the early morning being the time when the work of the garden began before the work of the house required both of us inside. I told Portia what I had learned about Prewitt. Portia listened with the attention she brought to everything I told her, which was the attention of a woman who has been doing something for 23 years and who recognizes in what someone younger is telling her the specific quality of observation that comes from someone who has been taught properly. She said, "What are you going to do?" I told her I did not know yet. She said, "You have time." I said, "Yes." She said, "Use it." I used it. I'm not going to tell you what I decided about Prewitt, because what I decided about Prewitt is not the end of the account I am giving. The account ends in September of 1860 with Alderton, and with the kitchen garden, and with the midday meal, and with what the investigation found, which was nothing conclusive. What comes after September of 1860 is a different account. What I will tell you is that the woman who arrived in Carroll County, Mississippi, in January of 1860 as a disclosed defect, as someone who had resisted, was not the woman that the bill of sale described, and was not the woman that Franklin Wycliffe believed he had purchased, and was not the woman that Alderton sat across from in the examination room in September without looking at. She was the woman who had paid the cost in Tences Parish and had decided it would not be paid again. She was the woman who had spent 9 months learning Carroll County, Mississippi from the ground up, from the wetlands and the kitchen garden, and from Portia, who had given her 23 years of knowing what grew in Delta soil. She was the woman who had calculated what the situation required and had provided it with the precision of someone who has one thing to focus on and who is focusing on it. She was the woman who set a meal on a table and left the room and returned to the kitchen and began the preparation for the evening meal, and who did not speak about what she had done because what she had done did not require speaking. She was Delia. My mother gave me that name. She was a woman named June, who had been born in Alabama and sold to Louisiana when she was 19, and who had spent the years I knew her being everything the system she was inside of required of her to be, while being, beneath the surface of that performance, entirely herself. She told me once when I was 8 years old and she was explaining something about the kitchen garden and the specific properties of the plants in it and what they did to bodies in different quantities. She told me that knowledge was the one thing that could not be taken, that you could be sold and separated and examined and transferred and labeled and disclosed as a defect, and none of it could take the knowledge, that the knowledge went with you, that the knowledge was yours. She was right about that. The knowledge went with me from Tences Parish to Carroll County, Mississippi, and it was mine, and nobody took it, and I used it exactly as my teacher on the Stanhope Plantation had taught me to use it, and as my mother had taught me to use it before that, with precision and with understanding of what it did, and with the full and complete and unrepentant acceptance of what the situation required. The plantation doctor did not survive the first examination. The account ends there. My name is Delia. I am what I am, and the knowledge is still mine.
This is the story of Delia, an enslaved woman transferred from the Stanhope estate in Tences Parish, Louisiana, to the Wycliffe estate in Carroll County, Mississippi, in January of 1860, following what the bill of sale described as resisting. Carroll County estate records document the death of the Wycliffe estate's physician in September of 1860, attributed in the official record to an acute digestive complaint. No official record names Delia as a contributing factor. The Carroll County investigation found nothing conclusive. Franklin Wycliffe hired a replacement physician in November of 1860. Delia remained on the Wycliffe estate until the end of the Civil War, when she was freed in 1865. She settled in Carroll County, where she worked as a healer and midwife in the formerly enslaved community for the remainder of her life, applying the knowledge that her teacher on the Stanhope Plantation had given her and that Portia in Carroll County had expanded. She died in 1887. Her grave is unmarked, which was the preference she had expressed to the woman who organized her burial, because Delia had spent her life understanding the value of not being found by people who were looking for her, and she saw no reason to change that practice in death. Portia died in 1872. She and Delia are remembered together in the oral history of the Carroll County freed community as the women who knew what grew in the ground and what it did, and who used that knowing in the service of the people who needed it most. The account of what they knew and what they did with it was passed down through the women they taught, who passed it to the women they taught in the tradition that had always carried this kind of knowledge forward, quietly, completely, from one set of hands to the next, across every transfer of ownership and every bill of sale and every investigation that found nothing conclusive, because the knowledge was not in the documents and was not on the land and was not in any place that the people looking for it knew how to look. It was in the women. It was always in the women. And they kept it. If Delia's story moves in you, the recognition of a woman who understood that the most powerful thing available to her was something that could not be sold or transferred or disclosed as a defect or investigated into nothing. Subscribe now and join a community that refuses to let these voices be the things that investigations found nothing conclusive about. These are the stories of the women who knew what grew in the ground and what it did, who carried knowledge across every transfer of ownership, because knowledge was the one thing that went with you, who used what they had with precision and with the full acceptance of what the situation required. Leave a comment. Tell us where you are watching from. Tell us what Delia means to you. Because the kitchen garden in Carroll County, Mississippi, in the early morning of September of 1860, is where this story finds its center, where a woman who had paid a cost in Tensas Parish and decided it would not be paid again, stood in the dark with everything she knew and made what the situation required, and left the room, and returned to the kitchen, and began the preparation for the evening meal, and did not speak about it, because it did not require speaking, because it was done, because the knowledge was hers, and she had used it, and it had been enough.